Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Um, we're going to give everyone maybe an extra 30 seconds or so, just in case we have any late arrivals. So do bear with us. But once again, thanks for taking the time this morning to tune into this webinar. We'll be covering the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill in a reasonable level of detail. Hopefully it will arm you with enough knowledge to take back to your teams internally to start some of these discussions. It is an important bit of legislation. It obviously has potentially a big impact for some people, not just for organisations directly affected, but also for those as part of the supply chain. But anyway, I'm spoiling my own thunder a little bit. So right, I think that's probably enough to get us started. So let's roll on and see what we're going to talk about this morning. So I'll introduce myself shortly, but then we'll move on to a little bit of background about the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, where it's come from, why the government's deciding to do this, some timescales that may be involved. We'll talk a little bit about the key policy drivers. So from the government's perspective, why they're doing this, why now. We have, as you're probably well aware, some pieces of legislation are already in place. So we'll move on to talk about, specific goals and provisions of the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, what it is that this piece of proposed legislation is trying to do, where others maybe should have done it previously. And then probably the interesting stuff, hopefully. What does it actually mean for yourselves, for your businesses, the organizations that you've worked for, things that, the impact in real world sense, I suppose. So if you are going to be affected by this, what do you need to think about? How is it going to affect you? And then we'll share a few sort of tips around, based on the current wording and expectations of the legislation, some things that we feel will hopefully get you ahead of the curve when it comes to being prepared and ultimately having to show that you are compliant with the requirements of the bill. A little bit of housekeeping. So obviously there's a Q&A box available. So if anyone does have any questions at any point, please just pop them in there. We'll reserve a little bit of time at the end of the webinar to go through as many as we can. If we don't have time to answer your question specifically, we will follow up with an email. So please do submit questions. We'll answer as many as we can in person. But again, we will follow up with specifics anyway. And again, if there's anything after the session that you want to ask, there'll be contact details presented as part of this anyway. So if you go away and have a think, I should have asked this question, please do feel free to reach out post session, and we'll be, again, happy to answer those questions. The webinar is being recorded as well. So if you want to take it, share it with your colleagues, anything like that, a recording will be available as well. So cool. That's enough introduction. A little bit about me. So my name is Phil Ridley. I'm Director of Cyber Risk Management here at CyberOne. So I look after primarily our consulting offerings and also our incident response team. My background is fairly broad, 20 years or so in cybersecurity. A large amount of that time has been spent in the governance, risk and compliance space. So doing a lot of work on security frameworks, both domestic and international. So a lot of stuff coming out of UK government I've implemented or been lucky enough to have input into. So this is very, very much my space, and we'll hopefully be able to share some of those knowledge and some of that insight as we move forward. We'll start with a disclaimer. So the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, as it stands at the moment, has still not been introduced into Parliament, and obviously has not yet passed into law either. So a lot of what we'll talk about today is based on the expectations, the that the government has for the bill, ministerial statements, that kind of stuff. The bill was originally announced as part of the King's speech when this parliamentary session, well, this government session started in 2024. So it is very much a key piece of legislation that government is looking to introduce. But obviously, with government being government, things never run to timescale. Again, there's no publicly available draft of the bill, so there isn't actually any legislative text for us to reference. So, do take, I suppose, some of what we're going to talk about may not actually end up being in the bill, but generally speaking, the intent of a lot of the stuff that we'll cover will be in there in some way, shape, or form. And again, there's no consultation on the bill. The government has announced that they intend to consult on the bill, but as of today, no further detail on that consultation or invitations to participate have been published. So again, some of what we talk about may be subject to change, but overall, I think the intention and the direction of travel from the government is quite clear. So we will, yes, take a little bit of a pinch of salt, but overall, we are expecting what we talk about to become part of the bill. So, with enough of that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the bill itself, why we're doing it, what it's for, and what the intentions are. So a little bit of background to start us off. Some of you may be familiar with the NIS. So this is the Network and Information System Regulations that came into force back in 2018. So this was a piece of legislation that was kind of driven out of Europe primarily, but we adopted it just before we left the EU. Back in 2018, and it was really to strengthen the UK's sort of legislative framework around what they call operators of essential services, so OES. So this was pretty much things like national infrastructure, power generation, the real kind of key services. It was a mechanism for government to bring a bit of regulation, a bit of strength around cyber. A long time coming, 2018's pretty late, let's be honest, in terms of what had happened up to that point in the cybersecurity space. But it was an important first step nonetheless. The Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill is part of the government's national cybersecurity strategy. So to protect and promote the UK online. So obviously UK government realizes just how important the digital and online space is nowadays to businesses, and giving consumers and investors confidence in that space in terms of security is absolutely one of the stated key aims of what the government wants to do as part of its national cybersecurity strategy. So NIS and also the Cybersecurity Resilience Bill introduced legal measures, both from a cyber and a physical perspective, for, as I mentioned, digital services and what they call operators of essential services. So digital services, things like online marketplaces, search engines, cloud computing services in particular. The Cybersecurity Resilience Bill defines a few extras that we'll talk about, and some thresholds for that as well. But also operators of essential services were in scope for the NIS. So as mentioned before, transport, energy, water, health, etc. So all kind of key, what we used to call CNI, so critical national infrastructure. Those organizations now had to demonstrate that they were taking cybersecurity seriously, and they were taking relevant steps to make sure that their systems were secure. So NIS, as I mentioned, came into force 2018, so 7 years ago. It has been subject to 2 reviews, one of which took place in 2020 and the second of which took place in 2022. It was primarily the second review that forms the idea that actually NIS needs to be reviewed and updated. It was also around this time actually that NIS2 in the EU was being formulated as well. We'll cover that in a little bit later on. But it was those two reviews that really sort of spurred the government to think about introducing a new and revised bill. So the expectation is that the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill will replace NIS. So NIS will be repealed, sorry, as a piece of legislation, and will be replaced by the Cyber Security and Resilience Bill. Obviously, as we all know, cyber moves at a heck of a pace. So a lot of stuff that was in those reviews and that will be fed into the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill is designed to really give that government sort of a much better framework to manage those sort of ongoing changes and ongoing challenges. So that's a bit of background. That's kind of how we get to where we are. The bill itself, so some of the key policy drivers that the government has identified, as mentioned, is really to continue to build the UK's cyber defences across critical national infrastructure, public services, and increasingly the digital economy. So as we've probably all seen, and I won't bother rehashing some of the names that have been in the press over the past few months, the digital economy is now a key part of UK PLC. And so the bill has really been designed to help bolster the government's ability to ensure organizations are taking cybersecurity seriously. It's important to stress that this doesn't mean that private companies are going to be in scope directly, but as part of supply chain, again, as we'll cover off later on, there may be some considerations for some of you to think about as part of these part of the bill's regulations. So yeah, the bill was really designed, as I said, to react to the changing threat landscape out there. In particular, some fairly high-profile attacks against the NHS and other high-profile other public bodies, excuse me. So the bill is really a response to those, to give government framework to manage and hold those organisations accountable. And again, digital infrastructure is really being seen by government as a key driver for innovation and investment in the UK. So many businesses, if probably every single business now in the UK is digital enabled in some way, shape or form. So having that confidence in the system, in the ecosystem, is really a key part of the policy drivers behind the bill. Okay, so as mentioned, the bill is an update to NIS. So NIS is currently the UK's only cross-sector cyber legislation. There are industry specifics. There are things like the Data Protection Act, for example, or GDPR, but they are very much focused on niche areas of or niche needs, I should say. The NIS and CSR are cross-sector, so it's really quite a wide scope of organisations and a wide scope of services that are going to be in scope. I mentioned previously the NIS2, so the goal from the government was to try and align as closely as possible, but also while considering UK specific needs. So obviously a lot of companies in the UK have ties into Europe, so the government didn't want to make overly complex regulations that wouldn't sort of translate over into those companies operating in Europe. We'll discuss NIS2 a little bit later on and some of the similarities and differences. But broadly speaking, the government has I wouldn't say copied the NIS2, but they've taken inspiration from it when drawing up the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. So the short version of events is you shouldn't be replicating too many of your efforts. If you are operating in Europe and if you are subject to NIS2, you're going to be doing all the things that you're going to need to be doing for the CSR bill anyway. And again, finally, the bill is flexible and future-proof. So, this is one of the key things that the government wanted to do. Some of the powers that are proposed in the bill will allow government and regulators to be a lot more flexible in their approach, and it will negate the need to continually introduce new pieces of legislation. So yeah, it's quite sort of able to adapt on the fly a little bit, which is great from a cybersecurity perspective, because obviously, we have so many challenges that just keep evolving on a day-to-day basis, basically. And for businesses as well, it means that there's only one piece of legislation that you need to be worried about, and you don't constantly have to keep adapting and changing and updating as new rules and regulations come out. So that's a little bit about the bill and the background. Let's dive into some of the proposed measures that are going to be in the bill. So probably top of the tree and most importantly is enhanced regulatory powers. So at the moment there are 13 regulators that the UK recognises. So these are probably organizations you've heard of, or probably maybe even deal with in some instances. So for example, the Information Commissioner's Office, Ofgem, for example, in terms of power, the FCA, if you're a financial organization, etc., etc. So there are 13 regulators, and the bill is enabling these regulators by giving them stronger powers as part of the legislation to monitor, investigate, and enforce compliance with the cybersecurity, the CSR bill, sorry, cybersecurity and resilience bill. So this typically is going to come down to fines. I know, it's what everyone doesn't want to hear, but the bill is going to give regulators a lot more power in terms of fines and enforcement. So we'll cover that in a little bit more detail, specifically what that looks like. But each of the regulators is going to have a lot more teeth, basically, when it comes to their own specific sectors. So they will. The expectation is that they will be self-funding a lot of these investigations, and the way that they're going to recover that funding is by fining people who are found to be non-compliant. But again, we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later on. The CSR bill is very much expanding scope. So as well as the operators of essential services that we've mentioned before, it's going to bring in a lot more third parties. So there's this concept of managed service providers and critical suppliers. So if you are a managed service provider or a critical supplier to an organization that is subject to the cybersecurity and resilience bill, that organization now has to ensure that their supply chain is compliant. So there'll be a lot more onus on you as an organization to make sure that you're aligning to some of the requirements that are in the bill. Obviously, the scope of that is to be announced, but the expectation is that whatever your customer has to do as an organization will probably feed down to you as well. So this is going to be, we'll talk about this in more detail, but it's going to be stuff like, having risk assessments, for example, having much better notification processes, incident response processes, all that kind of stuff. So there will be some fairly, not difficult, but fairly weighty requirements that will be pushed through the supply chain as part of this bill. Stricter incident reporting as well. So currently, aside from the Data Protection Act, there are no requirements under NIS specifically. The reporting framework, for instance, is I hesitate to call it weak, but it doesn't have much teeth. So the CSRB is basically enshrining stricter reporting into the bill and as a regulatory requirement. So it's going to be a 24-hour initial notice. So if this obviously extends out to supply chain as well. So if the organization that's in scope identifies that they have a breach or an incident, they have 24 hours to report it to their regulator. And there are also stricter reporting timelines around post notification as well. So, you know, this is going to be fairly weighty because, you know, having an incident and the amount of information that's going to be required as well is likely going to be more than just a kind of a quick heads up as well. So there will be probably some expectation that you'll have done at least some sort of investigation into why you've had this incident and be able to provide at least a high level overview of what's happened within that 24-hour window. So that's quite a big change from previous. And also, as I mentioned, follow-up reporting as well is expected to be part of the bill as well. So it won't just be an initial notification. There will be constant follow-up expected by the regulators, and obviously, you know, non-compliance to those reporting periods is going to be one of the main mechanisms by which fines and things like that are probably going to be issued as well. So what else have we got? Critical infrastructure. So again, the legislation is mostly targeted at critical national infrastructure. But again, supply chain resilience is a much bigger part, specifically called out in fact as a requirement. So whilst CNI is the focus of the bill, essential digital services, like I mentioned, you know, managed service providers, data centers, for example, are going to be in scope as well. The supply chain is now going to be brought into scope as well. So this is a big change. Wasn't present in the original bill, but is now specifically being called out as part of the CSR bill. And the flexibility to act, again, the bill is going to give the Home Secretary and regulators a lot more powers to identify specific organizations potentially or specific sectors that they want to bring into scope for this. The bill is proposing that, for example, you know, if a company, you know, has a relationship with a CNI organization, for example, even if that company, you know, only deals in with that one CNI organization, for example, and doesn't, you know, spread across multiple organizations, the bill gives power to the regulators and to the Home Secretary to actually effectively nominate that organization, that supplier, and say, right, well, you now have to adhere to the requirements of the bill because of your role within the supply chain. So, you know, rather extreme case, unlikely to happen, but that sort of demonstrates hopefully some of the flexibility of what the bill is trying to do and how it's trying to strengthen and react to the changing cyber security landscape. So quite a lot of stuff in there. I appreciate, you know, a big step on from what NIS was delivering and how companies had to react. So what does that mean in the real world, I suppose? What's the actual impact of that for organizations? So top of that list, a lot more organizations are going to be in scope effectively, particularly in the digital space. So data centers and cloud platforms are going to be brought into scope for the bill. MSPs as well. So if you are an MSP or if you have an MSP and you are in scope for the bill, then that managed service provider will need to be able to demonstrate, you know, that they are compliant with the bill's requirements. And again, the onus is going to be on organizations to really ensure that their supply chain is compliant, is meeting the requirements, and you're going to have to be able to sort of demonstrate that. The way that the expectation that that's going to be happening is through risk management, and in particular proactive risk management. So it's no longer going to be sufficient to just do an annual risk assessment. The expectation is that you will need to be a lot more proactive when it comes to your risk management processes. Resilience is a key word that keeps cropping up throughout the bill and throughout statements about what the expectation is. So building resilience is going to be through regular threat-informed risk assessments. So it's no longer going to be necessarily a tabletop exercise, once a year, gather around and do your annual risk assessment. The expectation is this is threat-informed. So you will have to go and be able to demonstrate that you're actively looking at threats and external risks within your space, and that you're building that into your risk assessment process. The critical systems that you use, for example, so there'll be a lot more onus on organizations to proactively go and look for potential risks, potential issues, build those back into risk assessment and risk management processes, and then obviously apply the necessary controls to those. So that's a big ask, I think, for a lot of organizations. And again, third-party risks are also going to be part of that. So it's no longer going to be acceptable just to have a single line item to say, yeah, we've got a questionnaire that our supplier filled in. It's all good. Third-party risks, especially critical services, managed services, stuff like that, where a big chunk of your technical risk management is taking place. That's going to be, again, the expectation is going to be that those are actively monitored, managed, and evaluated as well. So, a big chunk of time is going to be spent, I think, on this for organizations, and being able to demonstrate that as well. How organizations are expected to demonstrate that is through the NCSC's cyber assessment framework. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but this assessment framework is going to be the framework by which organizations are measured, basically. So when the regulator comes knocking on your door to say, hey, can you show to me that you are compliant with the requirements of the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, it will be via the cyber assessment framework that you'll demonstrate that. So there's a big piece in the CAF, the cyber assessment framework, about risk management and third-party risks and all that kind of stuff. So we'll cover that a little bit in more detail later, but it's probably worth having a look at it if you're not already familiar with it, because that is going to be very much the sort of the technical standard for how CSR compliance is going to be measured, and it will be up to the individual regulators to sort of measure organizations against that. And again, if you're a third-party supplier, have a look at the cyber assessment framework to see where you fit into that space, how much of the onus is going to be on you versus your customers, etc., etc. So an important piece to make note of. We talked a little bit earlier about reporting as well. So 24 hours is a significant incident. So again, we'll have to wait for the bill to arrive before we get some clarity around what significant means. But suffice it to say, 24 hours is your initial notification. And it's interesting because it's not just a notification to the regulator. The NCSC also expects to be notified about this as well. So that's a big change from the existing NIS regulations. You are notifying the National Cybersecurity Centre as well as your regulator, or the regulator for the sector that you're working with. What the NCSC is going to do about it is yet to be seen. But obviously, if it's a critical piece of national infrastructure, no doubt they will give you some support or input as required. The second stage of the two stages is that 72 hours. So your 24-hour window gives you, a bit of notification time, understand what's going on. Then at 72 hours, they are expecting a detailed report. So it doesn't have to be, the expectation is, doesn't have to be the final report, but they are expecting a lot more detail within those 72 hours. So that's going to involve mobilizing, obviously, instant response teams, plans, processes, potentially getting external providers involved, whatever it needs to look like. You've got 72 hours as an organization to submit that detailed report. Again, if you're a supplier, your involvement in that process obviously depends where the breach, where the incident is. You may be involved in that process. If worst comes to the worst, it may be potentially a breach on your end, in which case these requirements filter down to you. So you are responsible for making those that information available to the customer organization, and you also have to comply with those timescales as well. So definitely something to be thinking about. Criteria, excuse me, for incidents are also changing. So it's not just continuity of service anymore. So it's not just interruption to service. It's anything with a significant impact on confidentiality, availability, integrity of systems. So our classic CIA triad. So it might not be a breach that stops a service from running. For example, if you're a power generation organization, and if you can't generate power, that historically has been a significant incident. But if that incident now means that you can continue to generate power, but there has been an impact on, for example, confidentiality of information or systems, you're now going to be obliged to report that. So there's the criteria, the scope of the incidents that you're going to have to report, excuse me, have broadened as well. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting piece, I think, for a lot of organizations. And customer notification. So for digital service providers and data centers, so it's not just regulators and the NCSC, but it's also customers that you're going to have to notify as well. So again, if there's a significant incident that falls into one of the categories that we've discussed above, you will be required to notify customers. So not just a regulator, but you're going to have to go out to your customer base and give them information to say that, yeah, we've had an incident, etc., etc. So an important one, if you are in that space, excuse me, if you are in that space as a digital service provider or a data center, definitely something to bear in mind. So it's not just working with a regulator anymore. It's actually speaking to end customers about issues that you've had. What else? So empowered regulators. As mentioned before, regulators in each sector will get fairly meaty powers in terms of being able to enforce requirements. And will be able to issue directions to a regulated entity. So what does that mean? That means they can tell you need to get better, or that means they can fine you, or means they can basically make you under this piece of legislation, they can make you do stuff basically. So if you have an issue, for example, or if you have an incident, then the regulator will have the power to actually influence what you do as an organization, tell you to do better. They can fine you, whatever it is. Again, until the actual bill text arrives, we don't know exactly what that's going to be, but regulators will have a lot more teeth, basically. Yeah, cost recovery. So as mentioned before, the expectation is very much that the regulators will be able to recover costs from regulated organizations for any enforcement or regulatory activity. So enforcement is obviously things like fines. So if something does go wrong, the regulator needs to do an investigation and decides that a fine is warranted. Not only will you be on the hook for the fine, but you'll also be on the hook for the investigation cost as well. So obviously it's well within your interest to to not be in that space. Fines are bad enough, obviously, in their own right, but also being being on the hook for the actual investigation cost and stuff like that is not a great place to be. Yeah, fee regime. So it is expected that each regulator will set up their own fee regime. What it's going to look like. Again, we will wait and see. But the expectation is that it's going to be instances where there is willful negligence. So if an organization just hasn't bothered or hasn't even tried to be compliant with the regulations, as we've seen with GDPR and data protection, for example, the ICO, if you cooperate and if you can demonstrate that you've tried your best, then it is likely that any sort of fines or invoices will be less. But where there is willful, either ignorance or ignoring just of your regulatory requirements, then they will do their best to recover costs. Absolutely. Interestingly, though, each regulator is going to be required to publish their strategic priorities. So if you are in that space, and if your customers are in that space, the regulator for that particular industry is going to be expected to actually be open and transparent. So they will say, we're going to focus on these enforcement activities, or our strategic priorities are to focus on these particular areas, whatever it is. So it's not just going to be one-sided in that sense. The regulator will be required to publish what their goals are, what they're going to be focusing on, all that kind of stuff. So the theory is that should promote transparency within the space. But again, we'll see how that actually pans out in real life. So those are some of the impacts, some of the changes. Well, let's think about that in a sort of real world context. So we've got a few examples. Obviously, the bill is not live, is not active at the moment. But these are some breaches that have happened over the past sort of year or so. You may well have heard of. So Synovis, which was a pathology laboratory that did blood test work on behalf of the NHS. So they were compromised in a cyber attack June of last year, and compromised data was published about sort of 3 weeks after the attack actually happened. So in this context, because it's a supplier, you've got a couple of aspects at play. So the NHS trusts that were using the Synovis service would have had an expectation to conduct those risk assessments against their supply chain. So the regulator would be seeking evidence that had happened. But also Synovis themselves, there would have been an expectation there that they had the relevant sort of security measures in place, and that they were taking it, able to demonstrate, I suppose, that they'd taken every step necessary to make sure that data was safe. So in this instance, it's a tricky one, right? Because this is a data protection case as much as it is a operator for essential services case. That no fines have been issued from the ICO on this one, but potentially if this had been subject to CSR requirements, then not only would the NHS Trust likely have been fined, but also the company Synovis providing the service would have been subject to a fine as well. So an interesting one to sort of think about. Next, the cyber attack that affected Heathrow, Brussels, and Berlin airports. Again, supply chain related. So a software provider Collins Aerospace was affected by a ransomware attack, which meant that baggage handling and check-in services were disrupted. This is an interesting one because even though airports are critical national infrastructure, this was an interruption to service, but it wasn't a cessation of service. So, people were still able to get on planes, albeit with delays in some respects. But this one, most likely, the finger would have been pointed at Collins Aerospace. So again, the operators of those airports, Heathrow in particular, obviously because it's UK based, would have had the expectation that they should be, confirming that their supplier had all the necessary security measures, etc., in place, and then obviously the outcome of that is still to be determined, but it shows the importance of supply chain. Whether or not that ends up in terms of fines and things like that, yet to be discovered. But again, the supply chain piece of this attack is a particularly important one. And finally, recently, Capita were fined by the ICO, excuse me, for failing to ensure security of personal data. So this was pensions data in particular. So this was basically a failure of Capita to have sufficient resources and processes in place to protect people's personal information. So this is very much an example of an in-house system. So Capita weren't reliant on a service provider or anyone else. It was all in-house. And we'll talk a little bit about the NCSE CAF, for example. But one of the requirements in there is that you have sort of monitoring and visibility. You probably could quite easily demonstrate that what Capita had in this instance wasn't fit for purpose, and therefore, if the CSR requirements had been applied to this, not only would there have been a fine for the personal data aspect of it, but it would have been a fine, from a regulatory perspective as well. So there's a few things to think about. Obviously, supply chain being a big part of this, as well as direct organisations themselves that are in scope. So I mentioned NIS2 a couple of times. So for those of you that potentially are operating in Europe or maybe have customers in that space as well, broadly speaking, they do align with each other. So the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill and NIS2 align with each other quite well. Key things to note, though, key differences. NIS2 includes manufacturing organizations in scope, whereas we don't for the CSRB. Obviously, Europe has a lot of manufacturing. It's a key part of their economic output. So if anyone's involved in that space, NIS2 definitely applies. NIS2 has slightly different reporting timelines. So initial notification is 24 hours, 48 hours for a second notification, and then a final report within 30 days. So slightly different, obviously, to what we've talked about with the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. But that initial 24-hour piece is obviously the same and the important one to try and meet as well. Both pieces of legislation focus on supply chain management. So as we talked about with NIS and the CSRB as well, supply chain is now a much bigger requirement in both pieces of legislation. So again, a lot of the stuff we talked about in terms of risk, proactively managing your supply chain, threat-led risk assessments, all that kind of stuff still applies in this space. NIS2 has what's called extraterritorial reach. So if you're offering operations or services in the EU, even if you're not an EU registered company, you're still required to meet the obligations of NIS2. You will potentially be designated as an essential or important entity. So again, just because you're not an EU organization doesn't mean that you can escape the regulations, basically. And the same for supply chain perspective. So if you're a supplier into an organization that's subject to NIS2, again, the regulations sort of flow down to you as an organization as well. Fines, again, have been published for NIS2, so up to 10 million euros or 2% of turnover, worldwide turnover, whichever is higher. So yeah, it could be a sizable amount. But again, these fines are really just for sort of, willful negligence and stuff like that. If an organization is willfully neglectful in its compliance requirements. We'll see. Fines are an interesting one. With the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, the expectation is the fines will probably be in line with this or in line with GDPR. But again, it's going to be up to the regulators to set their fee structures. And we are expecting that there probably will be some caps or some guidelines in the actual text of the bill as well. As much as fines needs to be in place to dissuade organizations, equally, it's not within government's interests to bankrupt organizations as part of the fine process as well. So that's yeah, NIS2, sorry, versus CSRB. They align quite nicely. So again, as I mentioned at the start, if you're going to be subject to either of these pieces of regulation, there shouldn't be too much in terms of duplication that you need to worry about. Let's talk about the cyber assessment framework very quickly. Obviously, well beyond the scope of this presentation today to go into too much depth, but definitely something if you're going to be subject to this either as a supplier or an operator of essential services, definitely something worth looking at and trying to understand. So the cyber assessment framework, as mentioned, this is how regulators are going to measure compliance with the requirements of the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. It's aimed at helping organizations achieve and demonstrate cyber resilience. So resilience, again, keyword that keeps coming up throughout this. It's a really interesting framework because rather than a checklist of things that you need to do, it's actually written as outcomes. So for each of the 4 objectives and 14 principles, there is an outcome that is expected for each of them. So the CAF doesn't say, do this, do that, and you will be secure. It says, here is, what you should be doing, and here is how you can demonstrate that you are doing that. The good thing about it is it aligns quite nicely to other sort of pre-existing frameworks that are a bit more prescriptive. So if you're an organization, for example, that has ISO 27001, or maybe you go adhere to the NIST standard, or any other of a collection of frameworks out there, you can use your existing certifications in that space to demonstrate the outcomes for the cyber assessment framework. So it's not an extra certificate, it's not an extra sort of badge that you have to go and collect. It's merely an assessment framework. So probably, most of the stuff that you're doing internally as organizations anyway, you can absolutely use that existing content, those existing processes, and that existing documentation to demonstrate compliance with the cyber assessment framework. But again, beyond the scope of today's webinar to go through that in much detail, just important to know that you can use existing processes and procedures. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. And as I mentioned, it's outcome based. So it's not a compliance checklist. It's not a tick box exercise. It's being able to actually demonstrate that you're doing, what is intended as part of that framework. So conscious of time, having talked about all of that stuff before, what does that sort of actively mean then? What as an organization, whether you're going to be in scope as an operator of essential services, or whether you're going to be in scope because you're part of the supply chain, what should you start looking at as an organization? So understand your exposure. First of all, obviously, identify if you think you're going to be in scope. If you're subject to NIS, then yeah, you're definitely in scope. So hopefully you know that already. But probably start engaging with suppliers across the board. If you are a supplier, probably start picking those conversations up with your customers, just to sort of understand what the lay of the land is. Are they ready? Are you ready? Important, I think, to have a look at contractual arrangements. So, what's in there in terms of requirements, audit rights, information sharing obligations, things like that. So, for your supply chain, do you have the right to audit? If you are a supplier, do your customers have the right to audit you? There's probably some, again, beyond the scope of today's webinar, but there's some legal back and forthing to be had in there. When the CSR bill comes into force, when it does become regulation, there will be a sort of a legal requirement for organizations to have it. So maybe start to think about it, how you want to bake it into contracts, all that kind of stuff. Definitely worth getting ahead of the ball on this one. Big piece, risk management and risk assessment. Again, as we've talked about, and it's cropped up quite a lot during the session, proactive risk management. So have a look at what you're doing on this already. Is it robust enough to stand up to the requirements and the scope of the CSRB? Expectation very much is that the risk assessments have to be threat informed, and this is also in the cyber assessment framework as well. So, the technical standard for judging compliance with the bill is expecting you to have threat-informed risk assessments, proactive risk assessments, not just once a year kind of check everything's still okay. It's a lot more of an intense, proactive, managed process that's going to be expected. So have a look at what you're doing already. Does your risk management process allow for that? Does your risk assessment process allow for that? Potentially some changes that need to be made as part of preparation for compliance. Incident readiness, visibility monitoring. So with those advanced timelines in place, do you have visibility within your environment? Can you respond to that? Do you know when you're going to have an incident? Again, it is a requirement as part of the NCSE CAF to have that monitoring and visibility in place. Are you confident that that exists within your organization, within your supply chain? Again, if you're a supplier, the expectation will be that you notify your customers if you have any incidents, if they're in this space. So, can you do that? Can you do that within the timescale and to the degree of, to the degree of fidelity that's required by the CSRB? Incident plans, have you got them? Are they exercised? Are the team ready to go? Do you have the skills and knowledge to respond? So remember, 24 hours initial notification, 72 hours for the CSRB. We're expecting a report to go to the regulator. So, are you ready for that? Do your plans meet those timescales? Can you get enough resource in place? Do you need external support, for example? We appreciate not every organization is in the advantageous position to have their own sort of incident response team internally. So, definitely something to start looking about. At an absolute minimum, have a look at the plans and exercise them as well. So if worst comes to the worst, you are ready to respond as required. So those are the sort of the three main areas I've picked as kind of key takeaways for preparedness. That's it in terms of the CSRB stuff. If you're interested, I see we've probably got a few questions. Let me have a look. Yeah, there are a few questions we'll come on to shortly. If there's a more in-depth conversation that you want to have, we are offering a free 30-minute consultation. So if you're interested in that, if you want to know a bit more, or specifically how things apply to you, to your organization, please do follow that link and you can book a session. Quite happy to talk about your specific use cases. We also have webinars following on from this. So our next one on Thursday, 4th of December, as you can see there, Microsoft Ignite. So we're attending Microsoft Ignite. So if that's of interest to you, please do sign up for that as well. We also have a boardroom briefing series on managed security coming up. So these are 3 sessions, short and sweet, but 3 sessions from the end of this month through to December. So yeah, again, if that's of interest to you, please do sign up. So I'll move on to have a look at some of the questions that have been submitted. So Simon Kendall. So Simon, when and how will we know if our organization is subject to the new CSRB? Interesting one, Simon. So I think it's going to be a case of having a look at who you interact with, so who your customers are. That's probably the biggest indication. When the CSRB, the text of the bill is announced or made publicly available, that will probably be the de facto point by which you can have a look, and you'll be able to know for sure if you're going to be in scope. Obviously, depending on what you guys do as a business, who you interact with, who your customer base is. Obviously, don't know if you're a supplier or not. But if you're offering services, for example, to any of those operators of essential services, if you're an MSP, for example, you're going to be in scope. So my advice there is keep an eye on the government website, keep an eye on when the text comes out, and you'll be able to see, hopefully, if you're going to be in scope. Again, quite happy to talk about your particular use case in more detail if you want to book a quick call, and we can go through that and I can try and help you understand. David Starsmere. So David says, has anyone heard of a regulator being created specifically for MSPs? Really good question, actually, David. The short answer is, as of today, no. It's going to be interesting to see how that actually comes out in the wash. My expectation is it will probably fall under the ICO, certainly for the short term, to ensure compliance with this kind of stuff. All of the other regulators are very industry specific. I'm just looking at Mark's comment to that as well. So Mark said the ICO is going to be important for this one, but yeah, that as of yet, I don't think a specific regulator for MSPs has been stood up or created. I think the last thing the government wants to do is stand up a new regulator specifically for MSPs, but I could be corrected. We'll see what happens when the bill itself comes out. But as I said, certainly the expectation is probably going to be the ICO that will pick up the MSP aspect of this. Okay, so I think that's all the questions we've got in the chat. Again, if anyone has anything specific, or if anyone wants to reach out for a specific discussion, do follow the link on screen there for a 30-minute consultation. Quite happy to have a chat about the cybersecurity resilience bill and the potential impact for you as an organization. With that, we're at the top of the hour, so very good to have you all on board today. Hopefully it was a useful session. Hopefully there were some takeaways. As mentioned before, this session has been recorded, so you can drop back to it. Again, the consultation is there if you want to pick up on that. But with that, thanks once again, everybody, and I will leave you to the rest of your day.